Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. And I want to say thank you so much to our lovely Lebo. I think she has been an excellent, excellent MC. And it's such a great skill, keeping people entertained and keeping them thinking about what they're seeing and what they're watching. So big up, sister, big up. Big heart. So I'm going to very briefly reintroduce everyone. I'm not going to read their arm-length CVs because I'm assuming that all of you know how to click on the button when you go onto the program in order to read the CV. Yeah, you see, I see you nodding because you know. You tried it and you couldn't do it. Oh, okay, I'm joking. Let's be very, very serious here. So who do we have in the group? On that side, we have Mdluli. His title is Entrepreneur and Director of the F&B Art Joburg. Next to him, we have Norval, founder of the Norval Foundation, co-founder of Attfund Ltd and Green Create Group. Then, next to him, it's amazing, all the women on one side, all the men on the other. We have, I'm not sure what that means, Benjamin Fellous, who is the managing partner and an international art lawyer. Next to him, we have the lovely Genevieve Ray, who is a museum curator from the ABSA group. And if you've never seen the ABSA collection, it is a sight. It is really some great works there as well. And finally, on my left, we have Dr. Mdluli, who is an artist, an art historian, a writer and the curator at the Standard Bank Art Gallery. So on my weekends, I get the opportunity to work at the SABC. And I'm not sure if that's an opportunity or a problem, but nevertheless, it's the thing that is extraordinary about it is I am able to go in and see probably one of the most consummate art collections in this country. And I mean that. You walk in through that front door, and anybody can walk in through that front door, and they get to see art, an extensive art collection of some of the finest contemporary art, but also classical art as well. Is it classical or classic?
Classical.
Classical, okay. I have to ask the experts. Moi, je suis une blonde. So, let's go to the question at hand, which is the following. The role of private and corporate collectors in valuing and preserving African heritage. Do they have a role? And what would happen if we didn't have corporate and private collectors? I think it's very easy for us to say this is the world we want to live in. But what would happen if we didn't have private collectors? What would happen if the SABC didn't have a collection that anybody could literally walk off the street to go and have a look at? I think there are some issues and questions around that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what I'd like to ask all of our members here on the panel is, what is it that you do in your world? And within your ambit, how do you engage directly or indirectly with the concept of heritage? And I'd like you all to answer that question. So I'll give it to you again. What is it that you do in your world that can be described to our audience? And how is it that it directly or indirectly engages with the concept of heritage? Mdluli, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. I think on my side, part of the inspiration at doing what I do was based on the protection of my heritage. So everything else that I do is really about preservation of that heritage. It was quite important for me that I play a part in this greater ecosystem of art, because I've always believed that we can have all the money, we can have all the houses, we can have all the cars, but when we've left, the only thing that we're ever going to leave on earth is really our heritage. So part of what I do, as I said, the inspiration has been around how do I contribute to making sure that I preserve this legacy. The second component, what I would say, is that one of the things that I've done was a greater concern around how South Africans were collecting art. As the fair, just pre-COVID, we changed the model of our art fair to becoming very action-based in the sense that we were saying to ourselves, anything else that we put down, we must actually do in action. So when we said we're growing a collector base, it was a question of like, how are you actually doing that? We're not just talking about it. How do you diversify the audiences at the fair? What are the strategies that are in place to making sure that you bring an audience that takes an ownership of this heritage? So those are some of the things that I've done. So the second, the one other thing I can say is like building this BMW Young Collectors Core was really based on the mere fact that I have seen the pattern of South Africa, the pattern in which people were buying or collecting our heritage or preserving our heritage, that it was actually quite old. And how do I bring young people into the space? How do I bring young executives who are now at the cusp of leadership in South Africa? These are guys who are taking over the banks and are shaping the future to make sure that they understood what was happening in their corporations. And that's what I'm trying to do with the Young BMW Collectors Call. That's actually their main mission.
I'd like to come back to that in a little bit later, the idea of a young collector as well. Louis, a very young collector.
Thank you. I haven't been called that for a long time. Michelle, I wear two hats because on the one hand, I'm a collector. So we collect modern and contemporary African art and quite focused in what we do. And that's purely where the collector's at. And then I wear another hat where we started the Norval Foundation. And the Norval Foundation, first and foremost, was established to do two things. The first is to make art available to everybody, and second, to educate. And sadly, we decided on this probably because sadly, both there's no political and economic will in this country to promote the arts, to look after the arts. Unfortunately, we've had wonderful public museums, and they don't get the support they should get, and what they deserve in terms of preserving their heritage. And within there are wonderful collections, but I don't think it's available to the public. So we started the Norval Foundation with those two objectives: make art available to everybody first and foremost, and secondly, to educate. And education goes from cradle to grave, sort of. We've established a learning center, and I mean, last year we were delighted to welcome 9,000 learners through the museum. 85% of those learners are from previously disadvantaged societies, so they get exposure to, first and foremost, art, and also to the sculpture garden. But then, at large, and I think that's where the ecosystem is starting to gain momentum, Africans aren't used to growing up with art. They're not used to art. If we're opening a great exhibition and there's rugby at Newlands, I don't think we're going to win. So we've got to create a platform whereby we really can get people in there. And our greatest challenge is to get people into the museum. Once they've been there and they say, wow, this is fantastic, or we don't like this work, or we love it, or whatever, but that's irrelevant, because obviously this, that's what art's about. But our biggest challenge is to get exposure to people. Yeah. And I think the role has moved away from public to private, whereby it's our job to do that. And our focus with our exhibitions, by and large, it's African focus. It's very much African focus, sometimes diaspora as well, but more that. And it's very important for us to leave a ripple. In other words, what do we mean by that? It's no good us bringing in an African diaspora, a very well-known artist, flies in, does a show, few people see it because there aren't enough people coming to the art, and they fly out. We're really trying to make sure that there's a ripple effect. Who gets benefit from it? It's not him, the agents, and the ecosystem. And I think that's where we work very closely with the art fairs. I mean, both, I think the Johannesburg and Cape Town art fairs have done an enormous job of exposing everybody to the fair. I mean, we quickly popped in at the Cape Town Art Fair now. It's much bigger. There are thousands of more people, I think it's gaining momentum, and I think that's what our job is really.
Louis, I want to ask you something quickly, if I may. As an individual or private museum owner or space for the Norval Foundation, the space that you've created, there are a couple of those around the country. I mean, Zeitz is just down the road. We've got Javits up in Joburg. We've got a couple of those. The question that a lot of us ask is, you put the CapEx in, the capital expenditure, but then there's a question around the OpEx, the operational expenditure. And often what we seem to find is that the building goes up and there's an assumption, build it and they will come, which is not necessarily the best assumption at all. And I'm wondering how you deal with that. Are you prepared to continuously put in operational expenditure from now until eternity? Or is there a hope that everybody here is going to attend and you're going to just be able to cover your costs as you move forward?
It's like the story of how to make a small fortune. You start with a big one. You know?
Yeah, they say that's about a wine farm.
So, but the reality is, our family probably funds 98% of the museum. The income from exhibitions and admissions may be covering 10 or 15% of the running cost of a museum. So the thing that we lack in Africa, and I'm speaking broader, is unlike the US and Canada maybe, and to a certain extent in Europe, we don't have a philanthropic endeavor. The society is not philanthropic by nature, first and foremost. And secondly, there's no incentive. In fact, in our case, we have to pay municipal rates of taxes in excess of 2 million rand a year on an institution that loses a huge amount of money. Yeah. So we get no support, and there is no philanthropic endeavor. Yeah, so it comes down to, you've got to fund it, and if you don't fund it, you've got to close it. It's quite simple as that. We started creating very innovative things in different ways to try and get some income in, and I think we're making headway. We've learned a lot over the past 6 years, but I can't foresee that museum ever breaking square financially. So it'll always be dependent on people's graces sort of and wanting to support art and education. So unfortunately, that's just the hard reality of it.
There might be some people who say that there is philanthropy in this country and it's called black tax, but we'll take this further. Benjamin, as a legal person in the art fraternity, perhaps you could talk to us a little bit about the work that you do. I mean, we had a discussion, or Sami as well, just talking about some of the challenges that were...
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So essentially, as a legal practitioner and as a lawyer, we're facing several issues when it comes to heritage and art, because when we're talking about heritage, we're also dealing with the past, and when we're dealing with the past, we're dealing with provenance. And so when we're dealing with provenance, we're also dealing with potentially restitutions and the concept of good faith, acquisition. So one of the biggest issues, I would say, because when it comes to heritage, as a lawyer, is whether I would represent, private collectors or institutions, is to clear basically the works that we are considering acquiring, because nowadays, all the jurisdictions around the world, and as we move forward, they're changing laws when it comes to making sure that whatever is acquired is properly acquired and that the provenance is clear. But the issue we have also with provenance, what do we do when the two last buyers were buyers of good faith, but the initial buyers looted the work, for instance? How do we deal with this? And at times we have to go through political channels, and at times we have to go through laws. And as we speak, for instance, France is currently working on the refurbishing, of the legislation in terms of restitution. And what we mentioned together when we spoke earlier was about how even auction houses or even museums themselves at times are dealing with these complex issues we all have in mind, and I think it should be a red and a green flag in a way, what happened with the spoiled art with the Nazis regime, and how the legislation changed, and it changed because the politics went in and forced the jurisdiction to give back what was taken. And at the same time, the issue we're facing, and it's the second side of the story, because there is heritage and then there is art when it comes to valuation. Restitution poses a huge question, because if you give back everything, then some of the artworks that were accessible to a large public, say whether in Minnesota or New York or in Paris or in Japan, whatever, will still be accessible in the country the work is given back to. Then we are handling and considering the question of whether the country that the work is given back to can absorb, preserve, and make accessible the work. So it's a double-edged sword situation, and as a lawyer, I'm kind of like navigating between the financial consideration of what the market is and how we value the work for private collectors through several players in the market, auction houses, galleries, foundations, and at the same time, considering the ethical value of what it means, to preserve art and to preserve culture. Preserving art and culture, and this is how I will end this line. I think preserving line and culture is also preserving history and making things sure are put straight. And I think it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for Africa in general. And it's very tricky also, because each and every African country is very different. And Africa has to be seen as an intricate place where several jurisdictions have different considerations when it comes to art, and the political systems are not the same. And so this is where, the legal and the politics comes in, and this is where it becomes extremely complex, and where foundations and private collectors and curators are playing a major role in, speaking up for collections and the heritage per se.
Yeah. Genevieve.
I'm the museum curator at APSA. My day-to-day, I deal with students, learners that come in to view the history of money, because that's our focus. So we look at money, and then we look at APSA's history. I'm also the archivist, so I also collect and update our information internally. Yeah.
Okay. Sami, what about you? I mean, it's an interesting one, because you have a huge collection which goes back, is it not 40 years, if not more?
More.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I essentially look after two sets of collections, and I'll speak to both of them and how they're quite different. The one is the corporate art collection, which is the bank's own collection that they've put up in the offices and the buildings, and that has a primarily South African focus, and it's mainly contemporary artworks made up of modern and modern works and more contemporary kind of pieces. And then there's the interesting one, the African art collection, which is jointly owned with Wits University. And that one for me is more interesting also from a heritage point of view, because that agreement was started in 1978 between these two institutions. It turned 40 in 2019. But it was very specific around, the agreement was very specific on what would be collected. It focused primarily on indigenous African art from Southern Africa, firstly starting with Southern Africa. And it was done as a way to curb a lot of these items leaving the continent. So rather buy them and keep them here. And I mean, we will debate whether or not, again, the question of restitution, in that context as well, how it, but it's resulted in a collection that is, extraordinary, of over 6,000 items, from beadwork to pots to textiles. It is absolutely amazing, and also it being placed within the university setup to be used as a teaching tool. That for me also just spoke about how the foresight that these two institutions had at the time to what now sits, as this this beautiful collection that can be used and drawn from by so many people. I mean, I loved the previous panel with fashion. One of the people that uses that collection a lot is Laduma from Maxhosa. And it's amazing how he's drawn from it as well, not just from the aesthetics, but the techniques that are used. So it's a rich collection that, for me, represents the foresight of these two institutions.
Yeah.
And one other thing about that as well is what I realized also from this is that a lot of this also has to do with individuals, because I always say institutions are made up of people. So and you have to have, if you have the right people there, and that's what it was. You had two people that were passionate about the arts and African art in particular, and took the decision and said, we're going to do this partnership, and it's lasted 40 years. It's amazing.
So you've raised all these things. The one is around the issue of partnerships. The other one is, and that's been raised here as well, is this idea of value. And I think that there's this whole idea that corporates and individual foundations and the like hold these works for a series of reasons. And one of them is value. And then I started thinking, but why? It's not the core business of a bank to own art. So what is the value that everybody, and that includes you, Mdluli, and the work that you do, that you see? Because there's an intrinsic value, there's an economic value. What is the work that you guys are able to do and to hold in terms of heritage? Well, not the work, but what is the value that you're able to create? And is it a value that is accessible to everyone?
Sure, absolutely.
Anyone can answer that. I'm throwing it out.
As an art fair, we obviously play our role in terms of in terms of the ecosystem, especially in a place like Johannesburg, where we don't have a lot of big institutions that are like Joburg Art Galleries is quite difficult to access as a place, and secondly, the collection that it holds and all that history is not being exhibited, as an example. So a contemporary art fair like ourselves does play that role. We tick quite a lot of boxes, actually. When we put a show like that, it's not just about sales. It's also about education. It's also about heritage. It's packaged in that way. There's a talks program. There's the schools that come to the fair itself, especially on a Friday. There's a lot of buses that come in. And of course, as FNB, our partners for 17 years, they led the way when no one else was actually looking at promoting African art in that way, to become the first fair on African soil. So Johannesburg led the way. So that's already, again, just to add to what Sami was saying around leadership, it was really about the leadership at the bank at the time, with Paul Harris and a few other people who were the CEOs at the time, were like, look, this is something that we need to do, and they made a bold statement, and that's how long it has existed. So that's where we play our part, in making sure that people come through to the fair, and we play. So for many people, the first time they look at art is at art fairs, there are people in South Africa who live in neighborhoods where there are galleries but don't go to those galleries. And I've also been challenging the ecosystem itself to saying, it has been so focused on saying we need to get more black people in. And I said, have you forgotten the white people? Because also, I do know many who live across those galleries who do not go. So, but art fairs become like a soft landing spot for people, and that's where we play a role. And obviously, there is an economic value because we contribute towards creating a marketplace in that part of the world, in Johannesburg, on African soil, and encouraging people to kind of start buying and collecting their own works of their own people.
Benjamin.
When it comes to value, I see there are two sides. I think there's the intrinsic value of the work of art when it comes to beauty, so preserving what is beautiful or what is considered beautiful, and there's a huge difference between both. and then the extrinsic value, which is what the market says how much it is. And the thing is, see, I have no taboo talking about money when it comes to art, even if in France, in my country, we don't really like talking about money and we hate mixing money with culture. But at the same time, this is what the market is. What the market is. And I'll give you an example. I think it could be a very interesting example that we mentioned. See, you take the works of Dr. Summer Schlango that we are currently, she is having her retrospective. She's amazing. She's great. I think she could be compared to the African Kusama. And at the same time, when you think of it and when you look at it, you're like, hey, it's not as expensive as what Kusama would be, with Sotheby's or with Phillips or with Christie's. And then you're like, hey, what the heck? I mean, it's as good. It's a bridge between, the tradition. I think she's an amazing example of bridging, the past and the present. So she's a very peculiar and interesting contemporary artist, but then you can address the value question. So it's inherently beautiful, and it's great, and it has everything, but then you wonder whether, and it's currently ongoing, they're working on its extrinsic value, on its market value, but it's still ongoing. So you see here we have a good example of, the divide that exists between the inherent value, like what is beautiful and what is considered important for tradition, and the outside value, what the market considers, important or pricey, and especially now that the market is, speculative a lot. And this is also something that needs to be addressed and talked about without being ashamed of. So in a nutshell, I would say addressing the value is trying to bridge what is, beautiful, what is considered important for the art history, and at the same time, not being ashamed of, working on the, financial value of the work of art, because this is today's world and, playing with the rules, and this is also what makes it important, in major collections, auction houses, etc. So I think we should manage and find a way to bridge all the worlds together and all the players of the market together to find a point where we preserve heritage and at the same time we value it.
So it's, earlier on, we had that brilliant presentation where the term ecosystem was played out. Is it Bernard? My apologies. I know that you, Mdluli, talk about the ecosystem a lot as well. Louis, you mentioned an ecosystem. I mean, essentially what you're asking for, Benjamin, is a real ecosystem where we are able to say, okay, this is the ecosystem. Are we saying, and I'll put this to any of you, are we saying that this ecosystem is being built, or are we saying that actually nobody's giving a damn about it and everybody's operating in their own silos?
Could I maybe just, take a step back, and you asked earlier about the banks collecting. And maybe we all forget for a moment that any business is only successful if it's more than just making profits. They've all got social as well as cultural responsibilities. So if you look at the big banks, they invest in most of them have art collections. A lot of them have Investec is sponsoring the art fair, F&B is sponsoring that one, Standard Bank sponsors the young artists of the year, etc. And they all have big collections. And it's important that they do so because, number one, they're preserving heritage, and they have a social responsibility to do so because that's part of how you actually build culture, etc. We've also then got to look at where the world's moving from a museum perspective. And museums historically used to have their own collections, which by and large they exhibited. I think there's a statistic, and I could be slightly wrong, but I think 95% of the work that the Louvre owns in France will not be seen for the next 100 years. So what's the point of this amassing this huge amount of art if it's just stored away? And I think a lot of the private museums that have started, and if I look at the Vuitton Foundation in Paris and Zeitz and us, etc., they don't have intrinsic collections. And what they do is...
What percentage of your collection is in a case
No,
downstairs?
they totally separate it. In other words, our museum virtually has no collection, and we've got a collection as a family which they can call on. And I think that's where the money should be spent on exhibiting, making sure the art is shown, rather than buying art. And I think that's where the move has gone. It's moved away. And with the global world where things can move easier, I think there's no need to my mind, that a museum needs to own a collection. In fact, it limits it by restricting it. Whereas if it had access to all collectors' work, I think it's got a much greater freedom and can do that. So I think there's a move away from historically where museums used to own these big collections and they're worth big amounts, but the reality is they've got no value because they can't sell. And if they sell, people think there's a problem, So I think the world's moved on, and it's become a capital light system whereby museums' job is to exhibit, not to own.
Yeah,
Wendell,
which brings me to the point of how important. I think the ecosystem is fragile at the moment. That's my reflection of looking at it at the moment, especially in South Africa. It makes me think around the importance of creating this collector base to keep buying this art. Because if they're not buying it, it will not be exhibited inside, these platforms. I think the Norval Foundation is a platform, the Zeitz is a platform. In fact, when you're going through shows, as Louis says, you can see that the work has been loaned from other collections, to tell a story,
So that's a global ecosystem as well.
Yeah, it's global, and that's the trend.
Can I ask both
But
of
also
you?
just to add on the question of a person like Mam Esther Mahlangu, her art not being valued at the level of another artist in Europe or the US. And I think a lot of that has got to do, again, with how fragile the ecosystem is locally, because people here don't know who she is. A lot of people don't know who she is, and a lot of people are only just discovering her later on. It goes to show how important it is to really support, that the locals must support local artists and buy them, and really treat them with respect, so that the rest of the world can do so. And also, we cannot wait for the world to be the one that says, oh, we acknowledge Mam Esther. We should be acknowledging her first.
Start here, at home.
Agreed.
The two of you as corporate collection curators, what percentage are down in the dungeons?
Tricky question.
So, for the museum, not much. Most of our collection is in the museum, and it is open to public Monday to Friday, no admission fee, because the experience or the value rather that I put with the museum is an experience. It's priceless. You go in, you see how money has evolved from back then to what it is today. So that journey for an older generation person, that's nostalgia, right? But for a younger person, it's putting something that you put in your books, that you see in your books, to life. So we have most of our collection in the museum.
So, but the art collection?
The art collection, the corporate art collection, there's
Silent.
Yeah, I mean, Stellenbosch is pretty good in showing it, especially in the offices, as I said, in the public areas. Like, if you go to Rosebank right now, in the meeting centers, which are open to both clients and staff, it's full of art. So a very small percentage is sitting in the vault, to be honest. And then we have branches, where we've also just kind of scattered it throughout the country.
I mean, I suppose I ask this because the role in many ways of what you guys are doing is around making sure that there are spaces where people can come in, hopefully, and have a look at the art. Well, you really hope that they can. They may not necessarily find that easy to do.
Of course.
So how do you get them in? How do you get the kids in? How do you get, even at the art fair, I know they sometimes have kids coming through as well. So what is it that you are doing to make sure that it is open to the public, that the art is there so that we can see what our heritage is?
I mean, I also look after the Standard Bank Gallery, which, as you know, it's in the city center in the CBD. Very important, I think, in terms of keeping that area in the inner city intact, because I think, you know, one of the reasons as well that I think banks collect is that the one way you want to know what is happening in the pulse of a country is culture. You know, so, and then setting up a gallery where you can then show the art, and then making entrance free, sponsoring buses for kids to come in. So those are things that actively the bank did to you know bring in people. As a curator, one of the things that I did when I started at Standard Bank Gallery was to think about what's inside the space, because I thought about myself as a young child of like, when I walked into, I was lucky enough that my parents took me to a gallery at a very young age. But the one thing that always stood out is walking into a space where I can see a reflection of myself. And that's so important, I think, that a lot of young people, young black people as well in particular, one of the things that is challenging about what is inside these spaces that they don't see anything that is a reflection of themselves. And so I've made that, you know, very consciously a decision around how, when I think about curating in the space, the Fort Hare collection I curated brought in 8,000 people. That was the first show, and I mean, and
that's a lot.
That's a lot for a local show with local content, and it's, you know, it's the first show that kind of brought in those numbers because people wanted to see something that reflected them.
Those are the people that are going to your BMW Young Collectors, Mdluli.
Absolutely.
Sorry. I think the question you pose is what we ask ourselves probably the most at the foundation.
Yeah.
Being firstly, we're a destination museum. We're not in the hub, so we're not going to get the casual tourist walking past and saying, "Oh, what is this?" and that. So, you know, how do we get people there? And I think the one thing we've learned is that we're not going to get people there with art, because they don't know about art. So how do you, if you're ignorant about it, why would you go there? You know, the thing that jumps up most is friends of mine saying, "You know, I drive past the museum every day. One day I'm going to come in." And our question is, what do we do? So, and we've become very innovative. So we've started doing a lot of other things that bring people there. So what we do is we see ourselves as a platform. So we do a lot of family activities. We have garden days. And families come there totally not focused on art, and they do that. We have dinners. Corporates have dinners in the museum. Last night, the Cape Town Art Fair had a dinner in one of the galleries. We have literacy festivals. We bring ballet in there. We've got to do so many different things. Interestingly, I spoke to Frank from Strauss & Co. And they had a yoga class the other day at Strauss. And I said, "But Frank, why yoga?" He says, "We had 60 people coming in here. They pay to come in here, and a lot of them have never seen art before. So how do we get them there? We have to use other means. The other thing we've started embarking on, we started marrying wine and art, because a lot of people enjoy wine. You asked earlier Esther Mashlangu versus Kusama. I mean, the same happens in wine. You know, if I look at a bottle of DRC compared to a Sadi, which I think are two great winemakers, there's about a 50-time difference, you know. So, but what do is we marry art and wine. So we started a NF50 wine club. That wine club nearly sponsored for the entire learning center, you know, because we get people there that had nothing to do with art, and all of a sudden they walk in there. And our biggest job is to get them in the door. Once they're in the door, then they'll say, "Whoosh, we like the building, we like that." But that's our challenge. Our challenge is not how great is the exhibition. We've had wonderful exhibitions, but if you're ignorant about it, you know, it's like if I had to ask you, who's the world fencing champion? You may know, but most people wouldn't even know what fencing is. So why would you then go and watch it? You know, I'm saying the same goes about art.
Do you know that I am what do you call it, a Gauteng silver medalist?
So why do you think I raised it?
I did not know that.
No, but
You didn't know that, you see, that's like...
No, the point being, I mean, if people don't know, they're not going to get there.
Yeah,
and our
no,
job
I
is
agree.
educating, and education is to, guys, just come and experience art. And I think the art fairs are doing a great job, because I think that's the entry level.
Yeah.
You know, they don't go to the art. It's a social event. The Cape Town Art Fair this week is a big social event. It's not an art fair. And through that, art gets promoted. And I think that's the important one.
Okay, I'm going to go work
Yes,
backwards,
true.
and then can I get back to you, Mandla?
no.
Yeah, and I think in accessibility, we push education through the museum, but what we've done is that for the longest time we have this misconception that only certain people should know art. Through the museum, we allow students to go into the gallery. So we as APSA also have a gallery. We allow, and then the senior curator would have these talks with the students, lessons with them, asking them basic questions, their understanding of art, or understanding of the pieces inside. I think for you to be able to enjoy it or to grow in it, you need that basic exposure. I mean, if you start young, by chance, by accident, you went into something, a gallery, that exposure determines where you go in the future or how you move in the future. So I think that is that is important, accessibility, giving the accessibility, but from a young age, exposing them to these spaces so they can make up their minds and say, okay, do I go more towards art? Do I go more to heritage? Okay.
Sorry, I just...
So when it comes to accessibility, I'm gonna praise my country because see, we made a huge push in the legislation in order to benefit from the tax legislation. There are two requirements to be fulfilled for corporations investing in art. A, the artist needs to be alive, and B, you have to make it accessible to the public. So anytime a corporation, my law firm, for instance, or clients or whoever, whatever corporations that are buying art, if they want to benefit, so there is a tax nudge, they're pushing people in order to invest in art by making sure they're investing in living artists, which helps promote, new generation of artists, and at the same time putting the condition, which is very strict, you have to make the work of art accessible to the public, either through exhibitions, loaning to museums or whatever, like make it happen, but make it accessible. And if you make it accessible, then you'll get a tax advantage and benefit out of the legislation. So I think this is something very important. It may seem minor, but see, even if you have like a CEO who doesn't really care about art, and I won't be rude, but let's say he doesn't care at all, if you explain him, hey, if you're investing in art, you'll get a tax benefit. Believe me, he'll do it.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah.
So that's what we managed to do in France, and that's what is something that became quite big, and it's becoming, bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, they end up, having some interest in the works of art.
Yeah.
Yeah. So incentives are critical. I think if we are to change things, we need to find ways to incentivize those that buy art. I can see it from an art fair perspective, the kind of people who are coming through to buy. When I went to Sao Paulo, one of the things that I found really amazing about it was that all the museums were funded by the private sector, all the public museums. And then, but they were incentivized. And then the other thing is during the art fair week, there was also a tax break, So I do think that these conversations need to take place also with government. There's a big disconnect around this conversation of heritage, preservation of heritage. I think the way that government understands it is very different to how the private sector or the collectors or the people who are very active in preserving it as well on the other side. There's different players at the table. So if we come together with government, which is a critical part of this conversation as well, to find ways in which we can incentivize collectors, incentivize the private sector to actually go back and invest in institutions. It would really make a big difference, because JAG does not have to be reliant on the city of Joburg's budget. It can sit with the corporates. And I think corporate collections are really fantastic, but there's far much more that can be done. I think that the duty of your collections is to get them out to the public. The more, the better.
There's an interesting thing with Section 18A, is that, and I don't think it's changed, but Section 18A is for, it is for the not-for-profit sector, that if you fund certain things, you would get a tax rebate. Interestingly, the visual arts, or the arts in general, are not included in Section 18A.
Yes.
So education is included, but, and I think sports is even included, but the arts are not, and I stand to be corrected. I'm sure someone's going to...
I think it isn't
No,
included.
the 18A is so narrow.
It's
that,
exactly,
you
it
know,
is so narrow.
It's not even just for education. It's education for people in need, and that's fairly defined. So in reality, people cannot donate money to an institution and get a tax break. It's impossible.
Yeah.
So, there's just no incentive for them to do so, and if we don't change that, we're not going to have a change in culture, because I think a lot of people would like to, but the first question they ask you, can you give me an 18A? And we say no, because it's so narrow, and it's, as you pointed out, it's the arts are not included. So
I do want to, I know that the time is now 3:27 and 20 seconds. And I'm sure that it's difficult to see out there, but if there is anybody who would like to ask a question to our panel, yes, Nairi, I see, is asking has a question. But one of the things, it's good that Nairi is the first person here. Nairi, one of the things that I think that maybe, and I've missed quite a bit of this conference, is we really need a conversation. You talk about ecosystems, but part of that ecosystem is public, private, civil society. So public sector, government, we need them to be part of the push and the pull. Maybe they just didn't participate, and maybe I didn't see them, in which case I apologize profusely.
I believe the invitation was made, and we had someone from SARA here yesterday, so that was fantastic to participate with us. I guess my question does go to that conflict, and because we don't have government here, I will put it to you all. Mdluli, when you talk about preserving art, preserving heritage, the way that one does that with contemporary art and collecting contemporary art is quite different, I think, that with living artists than one thinks of classical heritage, which you spoke about in the beginning. And I guess for me, I see the art world and an art market, which has money, and then I see the heritage world, which is public sector, which has no money. And so I guess my question is, do you feel in the private sector that you have an obligation to help support our classical heritage, which is in public museums, right? So I know that we're collecting and et cetera, and it's going to corporate collections, and you're making it accessible. I understand all that. But what is the role and the responsibility from people who make money through the buying and selling of art to something that inherently doesn't, which is the conservation and stewardship and care of our classical heritage?
Who wants to answer?
For me first?
Yeah,
Okay, sure. I'd say one of the things that concern me is that in as much as we're all talking about going back to France, going to Germany, getting all this work back to the continent where it belongs, I feel we're almost going to go back and do the same thing with contemporary art, because that work is leaving the country. It's leaving
fast.
The biggest buyers are not South African, they're not African. So it almost feels like you're not paying attention to what we need to be paying. We're not taking the lessons through your work as well. So it concerns me that I don't see the contemporary art market more important than the heritage side of art. I think they both coexist. This generation needs to preserve what's happening now. They need to be more active. But when I look at the patterns of buying of African contemporary art and what is happening around the major players in the world, it's important that they start, paying attention to looking for African artists. But I'm very concerned that a typical South African artist will suddenly the pricing will change very quickly once they set up with the number one gallery in the world. And that changes the dynamics. It means that maybe many more South Africans will not have access to them, or Africans. Yeah, so I think both conversations are important to me. I don't know how you guys feel. Both sides.
Sorry, can I just push it?
Could I just answer you on that, maybe? I think what makes art so unique, you don't have to own art to enjoy art. And I think it doesn't matter who owns the work. It's totally irrelevant. What's more important is it made available for everybody, whether you're wealthy or not wealthy, whether you're educated or not educated, to have access and enjoy it. And that's what makes art so unique. And that's what we feel strongly about is, here's the medium where it doesn't matter who or what you are. If you get put in front of a work, you can enjoy it and interpret it. So I don't think it really matters who owns it. And it's good that there's an ecosystem buying and selling and making sure the artists produce the work. But ultimately, art's for the enjoyment of all people, and it should be as easy and as free as possible.
But it matters to the artist.
No, but that's the ecosystem. I'm saying, but to the people, you don't have to earn.
Oh, sorry.
I guess my question, sorry, I just want to be very clear on the question, and then... Okay, but should the art market subsidize making art accessible?
Wow.
Wow. Well, art market is also auction houses. Plain answer, no. Why would we subsidize why would what art taxes would subsidize auction houses? I don't see why. Should we support more museums? Definitely yes. So it's a question of, striking the right balance between, supporting more museums and, commissions that are acquiring works and that are sometimes extremely weak, even, in Europe. And this is why I think the US museums are a very good example in their strategies of, acquiring works and making them, valuable. But it's not necessarily government subsidized, but it's hugely privately funded.
Is there someone? We have got someone up there, and then we'll come down here.
At the back.
My mic is audible. Oh, okay.
It is on.
There we go. Leo Mila speaking from SARA, South African Heritage Resources Agency. And when I saw the topic, I got very interested because, private art heritage, the lady spoke down there, is not a conversation that's tapped into quite a bit. And there was a comment about ecosystems. And I think heritage legislation is also a missing component within the ecosystem in which you speak to. There was also a comment on values or valuing art, right? And looking at private collectors and the values. And obviously, there was in addition to that, there was a comment on then, the corporate collectors have a social value to it. And my mind started racing that, okay, cool, so you're creating a social value, but as a corporate collector, primary to that is the economic value. So now you've created the social value, and now what happens when the social value and the economic value start competing with each other? And now, as a corporate, you now want to sell, you want to, recoup whatever the value that is. And then now we enter into the conversation of heritage legislation, because that then starts, trying to play referee between these two valuations that's been created by private collectors and by corporate collectors, because you've been out there and showing it to people, and now you've created this intrinsic way of social people or civil society seeing valuation in what you hold private, and now you now want to make it leave the country. So I think to the corporate collectors specifically, because it was mentioned that the bank, it's not your business, in terms of heritage and the like. So have you grappled with heritage legislation, particularly in South Africa, and what it intends to do, especially as far as social valuation and preserving heritage of this country? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's also why I said the African art collection that Standard Bank has, there's a level of foresight in that, in doing that. And then placing it within the university setup, because that ensures, for me, also, part of the ecosystem, there's also scholarship. That becomes very, very important, because that also speaks about how these things are written about. And that then builds on the provenance of the work. So for me, I would say, in then considering the ecosystem, scholarship becomes very, very, very key in determining then how, we speak about heritage, we speak about art, who gets written into history, because that's what scholarship does.
But I think that Sarah question, I mean,
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I've got a slightly contrarian view to that. Exactly the point. Why is Esther Mashlanga's work not nearly the same value? Because if you try and keep everything in your country, international collectors can't buy it, and they can't get exposure. So you become, the big fish in a small pond. And trying to say, well, the work can't leave the country, and now it becomes arbitrary on somebody's opinion, and yes, Irma Stern can't go, but a young collector's work can go. They're both South African, and they've both got heritage here, or whatever. But we are shooting ourselves in the foot, because why does Esther's work not get greater value? Because there aren't enough collectors buying her globally, and therefore it's the pyramid comes down. The higher the works of Irma Stern or Esther ultimately receive, the better it will work right through to the bottom. And everybody will be better off. But by legislating and saying we've got to retain everything in the country, nobody's going to buy the work other than within South Africa. And right now, even the biggest buyers of Irma Stern's work are foreign South Africans living abroad. They're not the global market, because she hasn't had exposure to it. So I think, unfortunately, we think by preserving and keeping it in the country, we're doing ourselves justice, but I actually think we're doing disservice to the broader artists, because we are compressing the values that they could and giving them international exposure. And the ones that go global, they're few and far between. Right now, I can take out William Kentridge's works, but I can't take out some Irma Stern's works, and it becomes a very, what is heritage and not heritage, it becomes a very, very skewed line, but ultimately you're shooting ourselves in the foot.
I think there's an urgent need for both corporate and public sector to collaborate in topics like this. There is that guidance that we need from them in terms of how do we preserve our heritage in our museums and the spaces, and how does it link to corporate? How do we meet Chapter 9 rules? How do we satisfy them in that terms, and how do they satisfy? There is that urgent need of collaboration. I think we, in settings like this, where we have a conversation and then we hear what's expected from them, right? But I think that we need to sit down together, corporate, government, sit with the agencies and see how we can work around it.
Well, I think our biggest beg is that, and we want to say thank you to Sarah, and I think what you guys are doing is amazing. We interviewed them a week ago about some stuff, and it was really, really, really insightful. I think the biggest beg, though, becomes, we do see your hand,
Michelle,
and I know we've got 4 minutes.
There's the gentleman, he's been...
Okay, so here's the thing. We literally have 4 minutes.
Yep.
We're talking about a hard stop. So I'm going to ask you to do it in 30 seconds.
I'll try to be very quick. No, I just really wanted to get clarity on this because it seems what's being said is that the banks are somehow the proper or are positioning themselves as the rightful custodians of heritage.
Sorry.
And I think this is the question that you were trying to allude to earlier, to say that that is a profoundly slippery position to take because the role of heritage isn't stagnant, and even this idea of collecting makes this process of cultural production quite stagnant. And I'm asking this, or rather I'm saying this, just thinking about the types of cultural production that are happening in the contemporary moment. So we have performance, we have research, we have a lot of ephemeral, arts-based practices that this idea of collecting just simply cannot grapple with. So the question then becomes, how does the corporate sector ensure that the role of the museum in society is maintained, or at least its relevance? Because in the past, we've been having conversations about the importance of the museum, to say that it needs to be a space where society can convene around the current crises, right? It needs to speak, in a sense, to the material conditions of the people of that community. So that's one thing. And I also just felt like there's some sense of contradiction when we're saying that the art is, or at least the banks increase the value of certain artworks, and I could be misunderstanding you, right? In terms of this Irma Stern analogy. So Irma Stern's work needs to be bought, or it's being bought by international buyers, right? But my qualm is Emma Stern has a very real legacy, but she's also dead. So where is Emma Stern, the money from Emma Stern's estate or the selling of Emma Stern's work going to? Should it not be going to the museum and to the cultural sector? So that, like you said, anyone, whether or not they own the artistic object, gets to experience art.
So can I just clarify? I think you've raised a whole bunch of things. Firstly, I didn't see it as someone saying that it is the banks that own the cultural space.
That's also not what I'm saying. They're alluding to the fact that the banks, given not necessarily the crumbling infrastructure, but the ways in which museums are becoming increasingly obsolete. So rather than work to restore the position of the museum, we're being told that the banks are playing a new and important role, which is true in a sense, but ultimately I feel that the banks should be trying to restore the position of the museum.
Those conversations are happening all the time. They're happening all the time in Johannesburg. I can give you my
But
word
we're in
for
Cape
that.
Town now. Let's have this conversation in Cape Town.
Okay, my apologies.
We also have a discussion coming up next about money and how to pay for heritage, which is what Nairi will be facilitating that discussion. I'm sorry to cut you off. We have a hard stop. I told you guys. It is what it is. Can we give our panelists a
Thank you.